Hi, and welcome to my fourth talk in the Science and Faith Short Take series. Now, after talking about reductionism, scientism, and the God in the Gaps, this talk kind of shifts gears a little bit into a historical case study, focusing on Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, Wallace was not an anti-evolutionary figure. He was one of the co-discoverers of natural selection. But he did not think evolution explained everything, especially human uniqueness, beauty, and purpose. So why Alfred Russel Wallace? So this historical study kind of complicates the usual story. We usually have a kind of very specific story in mind when we think of evolution and with Darwin. So let's look a little bit more about this co-discoverer. So Wallace independently formulated natural selection and prompted Darwin to publish. He was not anti-evolution. He accepted evolution as a real and fruitful scientific hypothesis. However, he was not a materialist. He actually rejected the claim that unguided material processes explained everything. And that's where he's a little bit different. Here, Wallace is going to show that evolution and materialism are not the same thing. So he's interesting because he stands inside the history of evolutionary thought. He's right there, but he's actually questioning the worldview that's often attached to it. So for him, he was separating evolution from this materialistic worldview. And so that's what we're going to look at today, because when we think of evolution and Darwin, nowadays we put those two together. And that's kind of how it's been done throughout history, but that's not always been the case. So, what is that common assumption? Like I said, people often treat evolution as if it automatically implies materialism. So, let's kind of look at each of these individually, evolution and materialism. So, evolution is a scientific account of change in living organisms over time. That's the scientific kind of perspective. So, evolution is a scientific idea, whereas materialism is the worldview claim that matter and physical processes are all that exist. So, materialism is a worldview. So, we have a scientific idea and a worldview. The question is not simply whether living things change over time, but the deeper question is whether evolution explains life, mind, beauty, and purpose without remainder. And so that's what we're going to look at. Now, let's look a little bit more as regarding Wallace and his perspective. Like I said, Wallace was not an evolutionist. He accepted evolution. So the point is not evolution versus anti-evolution. Just want to make that point clear. Wallace said that every fresh discovery in nature fortifies that original hypothesis. So Wallace saw evolution as a sound hypothesis for explaining parts of biological history. So there's an important balance here that we need to make. Wallace was not rejecting evolution itself, but he was rejecting the idea that evolution explains everything. And so that's a key distinction in his thought compared to what we automatically assume was the thought process regarding evolution for Wallace and Darwin. So this key distinction is that evolution as a scientific idea is different from materialism as a worldview. So Wallace believed evolution was real and useful. He just thought that Darwinian evolution was not capable of explaining beginnings, human rationality, beauty, and purpose. So where did Wallace really draw that line? So what I want to do is I want to use like a chain metaphor. So evolution may help explain links within the chain. So changes from one form to another, adaptation, variation, selection. But Wallace argued that the chain itself raises questions evolution does not answer, especially life itself and the human mind. All right, so let me break that down a little bit. So what Wallace was saying was that evolution can explain some change without explaining everything. All right, so let's think about that chain and we have links. So evolution can follow the links. It can explain many biological changes once life already exists. So we have life and then there's a change from link kind of to link. So evolution is saying it can explain the movement from one link to a next. But now, what about that entire chain? Wallace argued that evolution does not explain the whole chain itself. And so he was saying that beginnings matter. The origin of life, mind, and human spiritual capacities require a deeper explanation. So the mechanisms of change are not the same as an explanation of existence, meaning, or purpose. So what he's saying is those links is not the same thing as the whole chain. Evolution can explain the links, but it can't explain the existence of the chain itself. All right, so let's look at a few questions. So question 1 is the origin of life. So can evolution explain life before life exists? Okay, so let's remember, what does natural selection do? So natural selection works on living organisms that already produce. So natural selection says, well, here we have a living organism that's already producing, and it's going to have survival of the fittest, and whatever adaptation or mutations are best for that current environment is going to continue through when there's more reproduction. Okay, so the issue is that evolutionary mechanisms assume that life is already present. We have an already reproducing organism, and then how that looks as it's going to change and evolve over time. But here's Wallace's concern. Life itself cannot be treated as a simple byproduct of organization. So he's saying, okay, natural selection explains what's happening once life already exists, but how do we explain life? So how is that relevant for current time? So these are origin of life questions, and they remain different from just ordinary evolutionary change. There's kind of a separation. That's a separation between the link and the chain. So instead of just talking about what happens once life occurs, Wallace is saying what happened to create life. So evolution can explain the change within living things, but it does not automatically explain the origin of life itself. And that's where he was kind of stuck. Question 2, human uniqueness. So Wallace thought that human beings had capacity that went beyond what survival alone could explain. So with natural selection and evolution, the traits and different characteristics that an organism would have would continue on to help it to survive the best and reproduce the best. Okay? But Wallace is saying, well, there's some things that why would we have that? It's not very necessary for survival. So why would those things exist? So a few things that he suggested were like mathematics. Specifically kind of thinking about abstract reasoning. How does that help us in a survival alone kind of environment? Music, kind of the beauty and the meaning behind life. So beauty, meaning, as we see in music. Creative imagination, such as art. The idea of duty and conscience and value that we find in moral life. And an openness to transcendence, a spirituality. So why would we have these things if our capacities were only based on survival? So what Wallace is saying is that everything is just survival. Survival value does not automatically explain truth, beauty, or meaning. So the need to survive doesn't explain these things. Now, survival can explain many instincts and behaviors. So the reason that we need to survive does cover a lot of the characteristics that organisms have. But that survival value, like I said, doesn't really cover truth, mathematics, and logic aim beyond practical utility. Or beauty. Music and art are experienced as more than useful signals. So Wallace's question was, do human capacities point beyond a purely material story? So that's what he was trying to figure out. And he also is very fascinated by the beauty in living things. So for example, Wallace used examples like feathers and moth wings to ask whether beauty can be reduced to just accident and utility. So he was really trying to understand, how do I explain or understand the existence of beauty? Beauty is not less real because it appears in biology. Even if I see it in biology, I can still see the beauty of it. And we see this in me specifically, I'm a chemist, and I can see the beauty of just the structure of different compounds and molecules. Some may see it if you're a cosmologist in space and in the structure of stars and our galaxy and our solar system. So seeing it in a scientific field doesn't make it less beautiful, but beauty raises the questions about whether materialistic explanation is the whole story. Why would we have beauty in nature? What would be the purpose? So let's talk about that. So let's talk about purpose and guidance. So Wallace saw more than accident in the living world. He said everywhere there is purpose and a continual guidance and control. So for him, Wallace was saying that's not just random chaos. Wallace saw patterns and direction in nature. And this wasn't just mere mechanism. He thought that law-like processes could still be purposeful. So even if there were a law that kind of directed something to happen, there was a purpose and design in that law itself. And so he was trying to look at, well, where did that come from? What is the mechanism that drives? What was kind of the thing that's driving that law? And he said it's not a closed system. He rejected the idea that matter explains itself completely. So, this idea of, well, how do we get the existence of life pre-life existing? You know, we can't say, okay, well, we have life, and then, like with evolution, it's presupposing that we have matter. But what was the thing that caused matter to exist before matter existed? So that's what he's saying. It's not a closed system. Something comes in and kind of initiates that. What is that? So this is why Wallace is such a useful case study. Because like I said, he accepted evolution while rejecting materialism. So Wallace is not useful because we should agree with everything he believed in. So I do want to say that. Like, I'm not saying, okay, we should believe everything, but he's useful because he shows that the history of evolutionary thought was never as simple as evolution equals materialism. It shows that it was a lot more complex even from the very beginning. But what does this not prove? So a careful historical argument obviously needs boundaries. So it's not a full Christian argument. So Wallace was not presenting this whole Christian doctrine of creation, even though he was trying to say, okay, what is the origin and trying to step outside of evolution. He wasn't necessarily trying to produce a Christian explanation and not proof of every Wallace claim. We do not need to endorse all of his spiritual or metaphysical ideas. So just because we can show that evolution and materialism do not go hand in hand doesn't mean that we have to agree with everything that Wallace said. There are bits and pieces that we can agree with and bits and pieces we can say we don't agree with. It's the same as kind of evolutionary idea. We can agree that there are small changes that occur, but do we agree with the macro changes that occur? And this is not an anti-science shortcut. So the point here is not to reject science. So remember, the scientific statement was evolution. The philosophical worldview statement is materialism. What we're looking at is that philosophical worldview statement. We're not actually looking at the science here whatsoever in this talk. So like I said, the point is not to reject science, but to question materialism. So the value of Wallace is not that he answered everything. It is that he refused to let evolution become a total worldview. So he's not just letting one scientific aspect then influence his entire worldview. So, like I said, Wallace had views that many Christians would not share. But that does not undermine the usefulness of his example. We can learn from his distinction between evolution and materialism without endorsing every part of his worldview. So why does this matter now? So like I said, the debate is often framed too narrowly. Most of the time, the common frame is evolution versus Christianity. But in this talk, the better question really is evolution versus evolutionary materialism. So this is not the same conversation. Many people assume, like I said, that if you accept evolution in any sense, you automatically must accept materialism. But the point of this talk is that Wallace is a historical counterexample of that assumption. So, how does this connect to this series, to my short take series? So if you haven't watched my other videos, this is video 4. If you haven't watched the first 3, that's okay. Maybe after this slide, you might want to go back and watch one of them specifically. But actually, Wallace kind of brings all those 3 together. And those first 3 videos covered reductionism in video 1, scientism in video 2, and design in video 3. So how does Wallace address those? So reductionism talks about how we can just be reduced to our basic fundamental parts. And Wallace was saying, no, humans are more than just our chemistry. There's something deeper and can't be explained by just reducing it down. Now, scientism is saying that science has all the answers. Now, Wallace is saying science is good. He supported the idea of evolution, but he was also saying that science is not the only way to know truth. We can know truth through other aspects. And then design reasoning. This is looking at the evidence and trying to see, well, what causes this to occur? And in Wallace's case, the question is what kind of cause best explains the evidence? Is it a design or is it something else? So Wallace's life shows all 3 themes in one historical person. He studied nature carefully, but he did accept evolution. And he still rejected the reductionist claim that matter and chance explain everything. So he felt like there must be something more than just an evolutionary or scientific explanation for the origin of life. Now, let's just take a moment and have a Christian reflection on this. Now, Christianity does not ask us to deny science. But what it does is it gives us a bigger context in which science, reason, beauty, and purpose make sense. So Christianity gives us a fuller account when we look at nature, when we're looking specifically at God's world, and we see it's ordered and intelligible. When we're thinking about the mind, human reason can aim at truth. Christianity gives us a deeper understanding of that. Beauty can be received as a gift and not dismissed as illusion. Purpose. Human life has meaning beyond survival. Christianity gives us a deeper purpose and a deeper understanding of what our purpose is in life. And creation. It helps us to understand and kind of think through what is that explanation, what is that cause for the evidence that we see, and how would we have these other aspects that can't be explained outside of science, like the mind and beauty and truth. And so that's where creation and this idea of the creator, it's not a gap filler, but it's the ground of all reality and the explanation of that next step. So what is the main point? Evolutionary mechanisms may explain change in living things, but they do not automatically explain life, mind, beauty, or purpose. So in this session, we looked at Wallace, and we noticed that Wallace accepted evolution, but he rejected materialism, and that distinction matters. Evolution can be part of the story, but evolutionary materialism claims to be the whole story. And Wallace reminds us not to confuse the two. So thank you so much for coming and taking a little bit of a historical dive into Wallace, one of the co-discoverers of evolution. Here are just a few references for this talk, and I hope you join me in my next talk as we continue in these short takes, kind of diving into very specific areas of science and faith.